is your name?
Camille.
What is your quest?
Finishing the American Duchess wrap cape.
What is your favorite
sewing tool?
My seam ripping razors.
Hello friends and fellow fans of fitted blankets, and welcome back. If your life was a movie, what would your theme song be? So today we're back and ready to tackle the front panel of our capes. If you're using a different pattern and it doesn't have a front panel, then perhaps this will be the stage where you add your trimmings and decorations before the main assembly steps. But for those using the Vogue pattern, we get to ease into our construction with this front panel here. So let's get ready to start sewing. But first, let's be responsible sewists and take care of some oft neglected business. When was the last time you cleaned out your sewing machine? If you can still see fuzz in there from a year or more ago, you're certainly not alone, but let's do our machines a favor. Go grab a Q-tip or 10 and give them a gentle clean to get rid of all that lint. While you're at it, if you have some sewing machine oil, go ahead and give it a squirt before moving on to changing out the needle. Now that that's all taken care of, let's make sure we have our bobbins loaded, our irons heated, some sharp scissors, and potentially a seam ripper at hand, and let's jump right in. The first thing to do is to attach our pockets, and I'll walk you through how to do the pockets the Vogue way, and then I'll show you how I did mine. So, if you're using the curved pockets from the original pattern, the first step will be to sew a line of stitches 1 centimeter in from the edge of the pocket along the whole curve. You'll use these stitches as gathering stitches to help fold under and ease in the seam allowance. So, set your sewing machine to its longest length of stitches and sew right along this whole edge. Vogue doesn't ask you to line your pockets, and it's certainly not required. But with pockets this large, I do think it's nice to add a lining in, and it's really quite easy. There are a few different ways to sew linings in, but I'll cover the simplest method here. Just cut a piece of fabric the same shape and size as the main pocket piece, put them together wrong sides touching, and then carry on with the rest of the instructions, treating the lining and the fashion fabric as one piece. So you've sewn your gathering stitches around the curved edge, and now you'll finish off the top of the pocket. First, you're going to fold under your 5/8 inch seam allowance along the top edge and press it. And you could sew your pockets on like this, but then the edge would be left raw and could fray over time. So what we'll do is open up that seam allowance and press the raw edge under. Those of you who are more comfortable with sewing will realize that there are some steps we could take here to trim down the lining layer and remove a bit of bulk from the seam, so please feel free to do that. But if you're super new to sewing, just continue treating these two pieces as one. Now that our top edge has been folded under twice, make sure to set your machine back to a normal stitch length before sewing it down. Once the top is taken care of, you're going to press under the seam allowance along the curved edge of the pocket, and you can use that row of gathering stitches we put in earlier to help control those wild edges. Just give the thread a gentle tug to help all the excess fabric behave itself and settle in place. Then you'll press this edge too. This stage can be a bit tricky. Curved hems always are, so just take your time and use whatever tools you need to, whether that's marking your seam allowances out with chalk or using a zillion pins. Once you've pressed it into submission, you're going to pin the pockets to the front panel using those markings we transferred over in video number 4. Match the symbols on the pocket up to the symbols on your front panel, pin the pockets down, and then sew them on along the whole curved edge. It should go without saying, but I also know we've all gotten in the zone and completely carried away at times, so don't sew the top edge closed. We need that part to stay open so we can use our precious pocketses. Think taco, not burrito. Now, as most of you know, I decided to make my pockets extra fancy, following this illustration from 1937, and I've already drafted out my pattern pieces, cut my fabric, and interfaced it. Each pocket is made of 2 pieces, and they all basically got the same treatment. Originally, I had left the same 5/8 inch seam allowance as the rest of the pattern pieces, but later I realized I actually wanted to bind the edges with some contrasting bias tape instead. So first I made some bias-ish binding from the lining fabric, then I cut the seam allowances off of all the pocket pieces. I also decided to line my pockets, so I cut the lining out and then basted them onto my fashion fabric with some giant basting stitches. Then the bias tape was stitched down on the front side by machine, trying to keep my corners relatively clean and mitered before the tape was pressed down and over to the back side. Then I spent a lovely Sunday morning in the greenhouse stitching the bindings down to the back side of the pockets by hand. Every edge of every pocket piece was finished off except the top edges, where the two pockets would be joined together. Then the two pocket pieces were laid out, the tartan patterns carefully aligned, and then the two layers were basted together with stitches that ran fairly close to the outer edge of the pocket to make sure the patterns stayed aligned as I sewed them together. Then I finished off the bias binding along the top edge before very carefully sewing the smaller pocket to the larger one on the machine, stitching in the ditch or sewing right on the seam line of the bias tape in order to create a nearly invisible line of stitching. With the smaller pocket attached on 4 out of the 5 sides, the basting stitches could be removed and the final pockets positioned on the front panel, using my tailor's tacks as general guidelines, although I played around a bit with their placement, paying more attention to the pattern of my fabric than the original markings of the Vogue pattern. Once I was happy with their position, I basted them on and once again stitched in the ditch along all sides but one before removing my basting threads and giving the front panel a test drive. So now that we're all on the same page with our pockets attached, let's continue with the assembly. First, we'll stay stitch the neckline just to keep it from stretching out as we work on it. So go ahead and put a row of stitches here, on a normal stitch length, but only ½ inch in from the raw edge. It should only take a second, so let's both go ahead and do that now, and then come back here afterwards. Now we're going to take piece 3, our front collar piece, but the uninterfaced one, and pin it to the front neck edge. Vogue tells you to baste it on first to wrangle the two opposite curves into submission. Once it's stitched on, we'll trim the seam allowances and then press the entire seam upwards towards the collar. So press pause again, go through those steps, and then come check back in. Now we're at step 7, which is where my process and anyone else who is adding a lining to their cape will differ from the original instructions. If you're not lining the cape, you'll stay stitch the neck edge of the front facing, which honestly seems a bit redundant if you've used a good stabilizer, but we can do it for posterity. Once you've stay stitched it, you're going to finish off the long vertical edge of the facing, the one without any notches, in the manner of your choosing. Vogue suggests either pinking it, overcasting it, turning the edge under and top stitching it, or using an overlocker. I would additionally add that you could use some bias tape as well. We've reached yet another choose your own adventure moment, so let me know how you'll be finishing off your edges if you're not lining your cape. And then you can go ahead and skip forward to the next chapter if you want for the next step. If you are lining your cape, this is the moment where we'll sew our facing down to our lining pieces. If you made a silly error like I did and cut your lining on an edge instead of a fold, go ahead and patch them together in the middle with a strip of filler fabric. Then be sure to skip the pressing cloth while ironing it so that you spray calcium residue all over your lining layer. Or if you cut it out correctly the first time, you can just watch and chuckle at this evidence that we all make silly mistakes. So first, I'd recommend pressing up the hem of your lining. Your method may differ depending on how you choose to finish your hemline, but for me, I'll need this hem pressed before I attach my facings. After the hem is pressed up, we'll attach the two long facing strips to our lining, in my case making sure to sew the hem of the lining closed. let's all go ahead and take a sewing break and meet back up here to attach the collar section. So this is what your piece should look like at the moment. A piece of lining fabric sandwiched between the two facing pieces. And now I think it is a good idea to stay stitch our neckline before we add the remaining front collar piece, this time the one that has been stabilized. If you need to clip your facings to get them to go around the curve, please go ahead and do that. I know I certainly did. And you can baste the collar on if you want, or you can just stitch it right on. Then, just like on the front side, we're going to trim the seam allowances down and press those seams upward towards the collar. So get ready to hit pause, run through those couple steps, and I'll see you in a flash. Now, I've already pressed the hemline of my fashion fabric up, but if you haven't done so yet, perhaps you want to go do that now. Again, it's going to depend on how you want to finish your bottom edge. Once it's pressed, we can go ahead and sew the front fashion side to the back lining side. Place the two layers together, wrong sides out, line up your notches and pin them together. Then sew along all the outer edges except the bottom edge. This will leave open in order to turn the fabric right side out. I'm also going to leave a small section along each side open so that I can sew my belt pieces in later. I've decided that I want my belt to cross once behind my back before latching in the front because I think that'll really help prevent that front panel from bunching up under the belt. Once you've gotten the layers sewn together, trim your corners and your seam allowances. So now by this point, whether you're lining or not, you should have your facings sewn on. But before we turn them to the right side, I'd recommend ironing all of these seams open first. It seems counterintuitive, but it actually really makes it much easier to get a nice clean line once you do turn them right side out. So go give them a good press, then turn your garments right side out and press them again. If you only have facings, slip stitch the edge of your collar over the seam on the back side before turning it to the right side and edge stitching the neck edge as shown in the instructions. If you're using a lining, you don't have to slip stitch anything, but I would recommend maybe putting a few pins in or basting the collars together just to ensure alignment of the two collar pieces before you edge stitch them from the good side. And the last step in this process is going to be putting in the buttonholes. If you've diligently transferred all of your markings from your pattern, this should be already on your fabric. So all you have to do is sew them in. There are only about a zillion video tutorials out there for how to sew buttonholes for every possible method you could be using, whether it's by machine with a buttonhole foot, by machine but with a zigzag stitch, or by hand. As someone who has sewn several dozen buttonholes with my normal zigzag stitch, it's usually my go-to method. But no matter which method you're using, I think the most important thing to getting a good, clean buttonhole is, first of all, to clearly mark where you want it, whether that's with chalk, thread, or pins, and then secondly, to do a test run, or 5, with some scrap fabric of the same thickness as your final garment. Work out all the kinks on your scraps before diving into what is, by now, a nearly finished front panel. And that's where we're going to leave off for today's video. Go hang your front panels up somewhere so that if the hem is going to drop at all, it does so now. I don't anticipate mine will drop too much because it's so stabilized, but you never know. We'll come back and finish these edges later when we hem the whole cape at the very end. If you've made it all the way to this point, go ahead and give the video a thumbs up and make sure you're subscribed. take a short break, go grab a glass of water, and let's check back in the next video to continue stitching up the main body of our cape. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!